Hello, my name is Bokani. Welcome to my studio. I am here to talk to you today about a piece of work called Say Their Name, which I made in the summer of 2020. I started working on it a few weeks, perhaps it was a month, I think, after the killing of George Floyd, in part as a way of my uh, dealing with the anger and the sadness and many feelings which came to the fore at that time for me and for many people. And part of my attempt with this piece really is to bring together some of the topics that I thought were related and weren't being spoken about, and the ways in which Black lives weren't being treated with dignity and protection and honor, really. So I made the pieces individually at first, but they became, they sort of made more sense together as a three. There may be more. And this was the first time I was using clay. So I used a clay on a canvas. So I applied this wet clay to the canvas, and then I'll bring you closer to the work. And then I really went into the clay and drew into it. And I wanted to, I guess initially, just make it a plain in which I could sort of carve and draw and write into the texture. And I wanted to layer in each part of it a specific symbol way of looking. And I started initially with this piece, which says in the middle, say his name, which was a phrase repeated during the Black Lives Matter protests, and which for me seemed to be a way in which people were saying, look, we need to recognize this person as a person and all the rights to which they ought to be given. And really I think it became much more like a monument to the many people whose names seem to go in and out of the news and be forgotten. And I drew into the clay while it was wet these faces because I began to feel as if the lives of these people were being treated as almost entertainment, the way in which Black suffering was so easily accepted, and as if these people were sort of cartoon characters and caricatures. And I really found that very dangerous, and we've seen that in history so many times before, what that erasure of dignity, of humanity does and allows to happen. And for me, it really felt as if this was part of a longer story. I included in here names of people who had been killed protecting land around their villages in order for mining to occur, and really for me it was all part of the same thing, right? If we remove the dignity of people, then it's okay for us to abuse their lands, abuse their bodies, abuse their resources for our own ends. And I think in making it, I was very aware of the complicity of myself in how I have been, and it really felt much as I'd made it to try and take some of these, externalize some of these feelings that I didn't want to recognize and I didn't want to become part of myself. I also had to recognize my own complicity in some of the choices that I've made and the ways in which they impact people very like myself in other parts of the world. So I made the initial clay paintings, if you will. So I added, I wanted to create this sense of either like a funeral stone, I guess, a gravestone, and wanted to give it that more solid feeling. And once I had drawn into it, I started making these sort of hatches into the clay, and I really initially wanted to talk about, the ways in which, as a Christian, I'm like, how am I called to respond to this? In what ways has religion, both mine and Catholicism, been used to justify the erasure of people's humanity around the world, and how do I respond to that personally? And for many years I've thought the personal is very political, and I guess as many artists talk about not wanting to have some of these moral questions in the work and not wanting to address these issues. I think for me it feels as if, this whole refusal for work to be literal, or for work to be, quote unquote propaganda, feels really cowardly, and this abdication of responsibility really just continues to let people go without being held accountable for the way that we act and the way that our actions leave many, many people vulnerable. And it sort of means that we can't move on because we're not saying there's anything wrong, right? There's nothing to address, or it's completely subjective. It's up to the viewer. It's up to individuals to decide for themselves what's right and wrong. And I found that really, really very difficult to leave alone. So to go back to the material, I guess, of this piece of work. After the clay had dried, I then went in. Initially, I had this palette of sort of blues and greens and purples. And I ended up settling with this cobalt blue because I, wanted to talk about how some of the resources that we're mining from the Congo make the devices on which I'm recording this, and on which you're probably watching this, and also on which we're relying to get us out of the climate crisis. And it's still at the expense of more Black lives. And that's really what I wanted that choice in the color to start to talk about. I was thinking about how we accept difference and address that as part of our combined heritage as a human family. And so the white dots are reminiscent of, I mean, I was originally thinking of Xhosa tribes and how they might use that in different ceremonies and then I went on and researched to learn about other tribes across Africa that use different facial markings and the differences, whether they're using them in funereal celebrations or more coming of age ceremonies. And I really I wanted to try and find a way in which addressing what we've done and being honest about our involvement can bring us to accept. I know there's so much in which people get very disillusioned with processes like the Truth and Reconciliation Act, and I think we can't quite move on or have a sense of justice without a real sharing of resource, of access to land, of real economic as well as legal justice, as well as socio-cultural. So within this, there's so much that to that last point, that these crosses, which began as kind of my thinking about Christianity and its involvement, I also thought about how land was, when people were signing contracts to sell, in inverted commas, land during colonialism, that land, those contracts were signed with an X because people couldn't read or write, that were being told what was in those contracts, and who could be trusted to be honest about that when they're very strongly incentivized not to. So yeah, I wanted to bring all these together to talk about past generations, our ancestors' generations, and this panel in the middle specifically talking about current and future generations, of whom, the youngest are seeing the difficulty of living with the choices we've made. Young people dying from respiratory diseases as children because we want to drive, we want to fly, and again, those impacts falling predominantly on young Black kids because they live in inner cities, they live in housing which is on the main roads or near motorways, and don't get to go to leafy green countryside schools where they can be away from all this. So for me, all these things are related, they're all interconnected, and I wanted to speak about them all in one place. I think I shall end here. Thank you for listening and for seeing this work up close. Let me move a little bit back so you can see more of it and get more of a sense of the scale. That's where I was sitting. Again, thank you so much for watching this, for learning a little bit about the work that I'm making at the moment.